Prepare yourself to enter the dark world of hospitals, where silent corridors hold terrifying secrets. Welcome to a universe where the unknown reigns. In the empty corridors and dark rooms of hospitals, chilling stories unfold every day. Tales of spirits wandering the halls, gruesome surgeries, and patients who never fully departed from this world. If you're brave enough to face these stories, subscribe now to receive content about the most spine-chilling tales. Since I started nursing school, I always heard horrifying stories told by the professors. Tales of haunted corridors, patients who seemed still alive even after death, and strange occurrences during night shifts. Being naturally skeptical, I never believed any of it. I always thought they were just urban legends told to scare new students. All that changed when, at 19, I began my internship at a hospital. The hospital was a bit eerie, with its long, dimly lit corridors, looking like something out of a horror movie. But for me, it was just a place where I would gain practical experience and learn more about my future profession. Little did I know that I was about to live through the most terrifying experience of my life. It was a cold winter night when I was assigned to work a night shift alongside Nurse Patricia, a middle-aged woman with a severe look and a reputation for unquestionable competence. Our task that night was to remove the organs from a recently deceased body. The autopsy room was a somber place, with lights flickering occasionally and shadows that seemed to move on their own. As we worked, the atmosphere felt even heavier. The air was cold and damp, and the silence was broken only by the sound of our surgical instruments. Patricia supervised me, watching my every move with attentive eyes. When I reached the throat of the cadaver, a horrendous scream echoed through the room. The sound was sharp and full of despair, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of a tortured soul. My heart raced, and my hands began to tremble. I looked at Patricia, expecting to see some sign of panic on her face, but she quickly composed herself. "This is normal," she said with forced calm. "Sometimes air trapped in the body can cause these sounds." She offered to get me a glass of water, trying to calm me down. As she walked away, something caught my attention. On the dead man's arm was a gold and diamond bracelet. With Christmas approaching and no gifts for my nephews, I made an impulsive decision. I took the bracelet and put it in my lab coat pocket, trying to ignore the chill that ran down my spine. I finished my work and went to the restroom. Patricia and I slept in the same room, in different beds. The hospital had a specific wing for staff to rest, but the environment was far from welcoming. The walls were worn and an oppressive feeling hung in the air, as if the building itself was aware of our presence. That night, I woke up with an inexplicable cold. My body trembled, and a sense of dread took over me. The same screams from earlier in the night echoed again, but this time they were closer and more disturbing. I shook Patricia awake, and she heard the screams too. They were coming from the next room, where we had left the body. The sound was like an echo of suffering, repeating incessantly. Footsteps began to echo down the corridor, growing louder and more threatening. The sounds approached our door and began pounding on it violently. The banging was fierce, almost as if the door itself was about to give way. Patricia, pale with fear, locked the door. We could hear the pounding growing louder, as if whatever was outside was trying to break in. "Did you take anything from the dead?" she asked urgently, her voice trembling. Ashamed, I took the bracelet out of my pocket and pushed it under the door. The footsteps began to retreat, and silence returned. In the morning, we found the body exactly as we had left it, but the bracelet was no longer there. Determined to understand what was happening, I began investigating the history of the patient whose body we had handled. I discovered that he had been a wealthy but cruel man, known for his shady dealings and the lives he had ruined. His death was mysterious, but after learning this, I didn't want to delve too deeply. One night, while reviewing old hospital records, I found a disturbing note. A nurse who had worked there decades earlier had reported similar events after handling a patient's belongings. She described the same screams, the threatening footsteps, and the feeling of being watched. Her note ended abruptly, and there were no further records about her. The next day, I resigned from the hospital. The experience marked me deeply, and I never doubted the stories I heard again. Some lessons come at a terrible price, and I learned the hard way. Carlos had always been a man of steel nerves, working at the morgue for over 20 years. He thought he had seen it all until the 9/11 attacks changed his perspective. That fateful night, the bodies of the victims began to arrive. The air was heavy with a mix of sadness, despair, and an oppressive silence. The morgue, an old and cold building, turned into a scene of horror. Charred and mutilated bodies filled the place, and the presence of death was almost tangible. Carlos, used to his grim work, felt something different that night. A cold wind blew through the corridors, carrying whispers he couldn't understand. As he worked, the lights started flickering. Shadows moved at the edge of his vision, and he felt a constant presence, as if being watched. Trying to stay calm, Carlos continued his work, but the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. Around midnight, the paranormal events intensified. He heard muffled screams, as if the souls of the people were crying out for justice or peace. Doors slammed shut on their own, and work instruments fell off the benches without explanation. Carlos decided to check a room where the activity seemed most intense. Upon entering, he was confronted with a terrifying sight. A body, which he was sure was dead, was standing, staring directly at him. The burnt face and hollow eyes watched him with a supernatural intensity. Feeling an indescribable fear, Carlos tried to flee, but he was paralyzed, his body unable to move. Carlos, with his heart pounding uncontrollably, tried to rationalize what he was seeing. It was impossible for the body to be standing, looking at him. He tried to convince himself that it was just the stress and exhaustion taking over his mind. However, the figure before him seemed increasingly real, slowly advancing towards him. Carlos finally managed to escape the room and run for the morgue's exit. As he crossed the door, all the sounds and paranormal activities ceased. Breathing heavily, he looked back and began trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning, Carlos couldn't explain what had occurred. He resigned and never returned to the morgue. The experience haunts him to this day, the screams and faces of the victims forever etched in his mind. Dr. Sarah was a respected and experienced doctor who had always heard supernatural stories from her colleagues. However, she had never experienced anything similar. On that early morning shift, she expected it to be like any other. The hospital was silent, the corridors deserted and illuminated only by cold white lights. Around 3 a.m, the emergency room received a patient about 25 years old, a car accident victim. He had severe injuries, and the medical team rushed to attend to him. Unfortunately, despite all efforts, the young man did not survive. The medical team was devastated, as they always were when they couldn't save a life. At the moment he passed, Dr. Sarah felt a change in the atmosphere of the room. The environment became colder and heavier, as if an invisible presence had taken over the place. She initially ignored the feeling, attributing it to fatigue and the stress of the loss. In the days that followed, Dr. Sarah began to notice strange events. Objects moved on their own, she heard whispers when she was alone, and saw shadows moving out of the corners of her vision. On a cold, early morning, Dr. Sarah needed to enter the room where the patient had died. The hospital was quiet, with only the distant sound of heart monitors and the echo of footsteps down the empty corridors. Sarah entered the room, lit only by the faint glow of a fluorescent lamp. As she approached the table where the patient had been treated, a chill ran down her spine. She felt a presence. When she turned around, her heart nearly stopped. There he was, the patient, standing in the corner of the room. He wore the same bloodied clothes from the accident, his face pale and his vacant eyes fixed on her. Initially, Dr. Sarah was terrified, unable to move a muscle. The air around them seemed to freeze, and a sepulchral silence took over the room. The spirit of the young man did not move. He just watched her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Dr. Sarah, despite being terrified, tried to communicate with the spirit that early morning, but without success. The young man's spirit remained motionless, his vacant eyes fixed on her as if waiting for something she could not understand. In the days that followed, Sarah couldn't get that vision out of her head. She shared her experience with some colleagues, but they took the story as a joke, laughing and saying it was just fatigue playing tricks on her mind. However, to Sarah, it was far from a joke. She continued to be tormented by the presence of the spirit, especially during the early morning hours. At home, The torment continued. She heard the sound of pots banging in the kitchen, woke up in the middle of the night to screams echoing through the empty corridors of her house. It was as if the restless soul had followed her out of the hospital. Sarah began having disturbing visions at night. She would wake up suddenly to see the young man standing by her bed, his eyes filled with pain and anger. Sometimes he seemed to want to say something, but no words came out of his mouth. The banging of pots in the kitchen became more intense and frequent. Sarah started hearing heavy footsteps in the hallway and doors slamming for no apparent reason. Determined to solve the mystery and rid herself of the torment, Dr. Sarah decided to seek the help of a medium. She contacted Daniel, a renowned specialist in paranormal phenomena known for his ability to communicate with restless spirits. After explaining her situation, Daniel agreed to help her, scheduling a session at the hospital in the room where the patient had died. Her colleagues continued to find the situation amusing. Many believed she was going crazy due to the stress and pressure of the job. Stories of encounters with spirits were seen as mere hallucinations of an overburdened mind. During the session at Dr. Sarah's house, the spirit, speaking through the medium Daniel, revealed a crucial detail. The medical error that caused his death was made by another doctor who performed the initial triage. This error was fatal and irreversible. Furthermore, the young spirit revealed something even more painful. He was about to become a father, and the idea of not being able to watch his child's life left his soul furious and restless. Sarah carefully reviewed the young man's medical records, focusing especially on the initial triage done by another doctor. She found inconsistencies and errors in the reports, including incorrect diagnoses and inadequate treatments. She began discreetly interviewing colleagues who were on duty that night. She discovered that the doctor responsible for the initial triage had made similar errors in the past, but these incidents were covered up to protect the hospital's reputation. In a private meeting, Sarah presented all the evidence to the doctor. He initially denied it, but the weight of the evidence was too much. The doctor finally confessed his error and explained that he was overwhelmed and exhausted that night, which led to the wrong diagnosis. He also revealed that he feared professional repercussions and thus hid the error. Determined to seek justice, Sarah exposed the medical error to the hospital administrators. The hospital initiated an internal review and implemented new policies to prevent such errors from happening again. The responsible doctor was suspended and faced disciplinary measures. After the public revelation and the doctor's confession, Sarah and Daniel conducted one last session to communicate the justice done to the young man's spirit. With justice finally served, the spirit began to slowly disappear, leaving a sense of peace in the room. Thank you for staying with us and exploring these chilling stories. If you enjoyed the content and want more scary stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This way, we can continue bringing more terror and mystery to you. See you next time, and may the scares always be within your reach.